Should a sermon be long or short? In some ways, that question is like asking, what's better, an old house or a new house? Well, it kind of depends. An old house might be great for some people because they love to restore and bring back to life something that's old. A new house might be better for other people who just want something to move into that's ready to go. I think the same is true for the length of your sermons. For some people, it makes sense to preach for a long time because of the context, because of the tradition, because of their style, and the way that they like to preach. For other people, it makes way more sense for them to keep it brief and to the point. I think so much of the success of a given sermon has less to do with length and more to do with the discipline of your words, with the economy of words. I think a lot of pastors use way too many words to say the thing that they want to get across. So in this video, we're gonna look at how long a sermon should be, but we're gonna look at it through a different lens. We're gonna look at it from a different angle. I think it's really going to be beneficial, especially if you've ever struggled with the question, how long should my sermons be? Or if you've ever left a sermon and thought, gosh, that kind of was too long. Or if you've ever felt like maybe I'm not preaching long enough, which is usually not the case for most people. We're gonna get into all that in this video. My name is Lane. This is Preaching Donkey. It's so awesome to have you joining me today. I'm gonna give you a gift for being here. Go to preachingdonkey.com/21days. You can pick up my free 21-day guide to creating killer sermons. It's a 3-week, 3-step process that walks you through creating and delivering a really compelling, clear, concise, impactful message. So again, go to preachingdonkey.com/21days. All right, let's jump in with a story. And I think this is gonna illustrate what some of us do in our messages. The other day I was talking to my 3-year-old and I was trying to explain to her why she wasn't able to use her iPad. Before you get mad at me for letting my 3-year-old use an iPad, we limit screen time and we have strict parental controls. We weren't allowing her to use her iPad this entire day because the previous day she would not stay in her room at bedtime. She kept coming out again and again and again. And finally we said, okay, tomorrow you're not gonna be able to use your iPad. Now, when she would cry about her iPad and she would wanna know why, I would explain it to her. And to be honest with you, I kind of enjoyed, if you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. There was a part of me that kind of enjoyed explaining to her why we weren't letting her use her iPad. Isn't it terrible? You're not getting to use your iPad because you kept going out of your room last night. You kept going out of your room again and again and again, and you can't use your iPad now because you kept going out of your room. Do you know why you can't use your iPad? Because you kept leaving your room. Do you think tomorrow maybe you won't leave your room? You kept leaving your room, and that's why you're not able to use your iPad. Doesn't that stink? And I went on and on and on, and what I realized is that she was no longer listening. It no longer made any sense to her. She wasn't paying attention. It didn't matter. And I think a lot of times, preaching a long time in our sermons is really the result of that kind of undisciplined speaking. Just thinking, if we can just say the point, just say the words over and over and over and just keep repeating ourselves, then eventually they'll get it. Eventually it'll all make sense. Eventually they'll hear us. And the problem is, it doesn't quite work that way. Most people, just like my 3-year-old, will eventually start to tune us out and start to think that whatever we're saying is just noise. They'll grab their phone and they'll start scrolling through it because it's more interesting than our repetition. It's more interesting than our rambling. And so this is why I think so many of us end up with a default position of a long sermon simply because we consider ourselves long-winded. We just talk for a long time. But as I've worked with so many pastors over these last several years, what I have found is that so many preachers preach for a long time because they think that it's a spiritual issue. For them, and this might be you, for them it comes down to, well, hey, listen, if I'm gonna open up the word and I'm gonna preach, then it has to be X amount of minutes and fill in the blank. It's gotta be 40 minutes, it's gotta be 50 minutes, it's gotta be 90 minutes, whatever the case. And for them, it's really a conviction of it has to be this long for it to be a substantive message. And respectfully, I challenge them on this because I consider that way of thinking a fallacy. You can have a sermon where you're talking for 45 minutes and it completely lacks substance. Or you could have a sermon where you talk for 15 minutes and it's packed with life-changing substantive content. It's packed with gospel-centered, Bible-saturated preaching in 15 minutes. Now, I'm not saying you need to preach for 15 minutes, and I'm not saying you shouldn't preach for 40, but I'm saying the length of time is not a spiritual issue. It's not a sin issue. If you decide to preach for 40 minutes, that's awesome. If you decide to preach for 15, that's awesome. The point is, make what you're saying matter. What I find is that it's far less of a spiritual issue. For most pastors, the reason why they tend to preach a long time is simply because they're unskilled at determining what doesn't need to be in the sermon. So many pastors lack the ability during their preparation to look at their notes and say, here's what needs to stay in and here's what needs to go out. I know for me, this was the hardest skill, and it remains the hardest skill to hone when I preach, and that is determining what of this needs to stay in and what needs to go. Editing is such a vital part of this process. You have to be almost brutal with your content to say what is the most important thing that needs to be said in this sermon to teach this text to drive this result. You're not going to be able to say everything that needs to be said in every sermon in one sermon, right? You're not going to be able to give people a full biblical diet in one sermon. What you want to do is determine, if I've got these 30 minutes, these 35 minutes, whatever it is, if I've got this amount of time, what is going to keep people's attention, keep them drawn into what I'm saying, and what matters most, and what's not as important. And to do that, you really have to drill down and say, what is my bottom line? What is the main idea that I'm driving home? And that comes from my study of the text, which is incredibly important. So if I've studied that and I've got this mountain of content that's compelling and it's awesome, I've got to be willing to say, can't have this, can't have this, can't have this, can't have this, because this is the essence. And I want to spur people, I want to bring out their desire to go search the scriptures and find all these things. And I'm going to build tension around that stuff. But if I really want my sermons to have an impact, I've got to drill down to the essence and I've got to deliver that. The famous novelist Stephen King says that when it comes to editing your content, kill your darlings, kill your darlings, kill your darlings. Now, because it's Stephen King, it's pretty violent, right? But what he's saying is that when you write, whether it's a novel, a creepy, weird novel, whether it's a nonfiction book, or whether it's a sermon that you're going to preach on Sunday, when you write, those words, those concepts are your darlings, and you have to be willing to let them go. You have to be willing to kick them to the curb. You have to be willing to say, maybe next time, maybe next week, maybe next sermon, maybe I'll put this in supplemental content, maybe I'll write a devotional, but for this sermon, these are the concepts that are the most important, and they're driven by my bottom line, which comes from the text. If you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, this sounds great, but how do I do it? How do I have a disciplined message where my words are purposeful and they matter and they drive home the point that I want? And this isn't a matter of length necessarily, but one trick that I have found that makes this all much easier to do, and that is this: limit the amount of time that you give yourself for a sermon. That's the first step. So let's say that right now you have 40 minutes that you're allowed for your sermon. In your preparation, reduce that to 35. Just kind of tell yourself, I only have 35 minutes. What that does is that when you prepare, now you're going to have to look at it and say, okay, what of this is going to fit in 35 minutes? Not 40, not 45, not 50, but 35. That's how much time I have. And by necessity, you're going to have to cut things out. You're going to have to look at it and say, I can't fit everything. So what's most important? And then if you have a range of time, like if you're given 25 to 35 minutes, plan for the lower end of that range. And then rehearse your message and see what is the most important thing that can only fit in 25 minutes. You know, Jack Dorsey, the creator of Twitter, when Twitter first came out for the first several years, you could only fit 140 characters. And the idea behind that was that back in those days, a text message was limited to 160. So they said, let's make it 140. That'll leave 20 characters for whatever your handle is. And then that'll be your tweet. That lasted for a long time. And what that did is it forced people to try to figure out how to create a message, how to send a message in 140 characters. Now it's 280 and most people use threads and all that. But the point is, one of the things that he said is that limitations spur creativity. So if you have a shorter time frame, right? You only have 140 characters. You only have 25 minutes. It's not like 25 minutes is the magic number, or 30 minutes, or 15, or 35. The point is the limitation itself is what spurs you to say, I have to make a choice. I have to decide what stays and what goes. And over time, this discipline begins to give you the skill to know just intuitively, this is worthy of this sermon because it fits with the bottom line, and this isn't. This can wait. And that's a skill that takes ordinary sermons and sets them over the top and makes them extraordinary. Because remember, our goal is life change. We have the most important message in the world, the gospel, the saving gospel of Jesus Christ, that he came, that he lived, that he died, and that in him we have life. In him we have access to the Father. In him we have grace and everything and forgiveness of our sins. It's an amazing message. And so when we do exercises like this, it's because we believe in that message. We want people to hear it. And so if we're rambling and if we're saying undisciplined words, and if we start to just sound like me talking to my 3-year-old, telling her 17 different ways why she can't have her iPad, it starts to become just noise. I don't want that for you. I want for you to have a sermon that is tight, that is clean, that gets to the point, that doesn't lack substance. It's not shallow. Don't mishear me. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's disciplined, that it's skilled, that you have rightly divided not just the word of truth, but your own words. And you've said, okay, this can go and this can stay, because what I want to do is I want to reveal the text and I want people to see it. And I want my main idea to come alive in their hearts and minds. And then I want them to be motivated to do two things. I want them to be motivated to dig in deeper to the text, because one sermon's not going to do it. And I want them to be motivated to go live it out, to go apply what I've taught and what they've found in Scripture. This right here is a playlist where you can go further into how to write a message in 7 steps. I would love for you to check it out. Be sure to give me a comment. How long do you preach? What do you find the most difficult part of leaving things in your message or taking things out of your message? Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, and I'll see you in the next video.